6 years. And you still show up to your own birthday looking like that. Natalie has been patient long enough. Anyone with eyes can see that.
To the woman who built something worth celebrating.
You wanted to be the center of attention tonight? Fine. There. Wait, don't move, I'm recording.
She had been building toward that moment for longer than anyone in the room realized. Every cutting remark her mother made, every smirk Blake allowed himself at my expense, every video Aaron captured, none of it was spontaneous. It was choreographed. And she delivered the final line with the kind of ease that only comes from someone who believes the outcome is already decided. What she did not account for was the ring on my finger, the one she had dismissed for years without ever once asking what the engraving on the inside actually meant. If this story is hitting close to home for you, go ahead and subscribe every week. There's a new story here, and some of them will surprise you. My name is Wesley Northcott, and for 6 years I woke up every morning in a house that smelled like fresh paint and ambition that wasn't mine. I ran a small restoration workshop on the east side of Charlotte, the kind of place most people drove past without looking twice. I fixed things other people had given up on. Old chairs with cracked legs, cabinet doors warped by decades of humidity, dining tables someone's grandmother had left behind. I never thought of it as a lesser life. I thought of it as honest work, and for a long time I believed that was enough. Natalie never saw it that way. She had built Varden Eventworks from a shared office space and a borrowed projector into something with actual clients, actual contracts, and a logo that appeared on everything she touched, including, as I would discover on the evening of my 38th birthday, the cocktail napkins at my own party. She had framed the event as something intimate, a small gathering to mark the occasion. What she had actually done was rent out our living room to her own brand. The guests were almost entirely her people. Her mother, Denise, who had made it a personal project to remind me at every family dinner that Natalie could have married someone with real prospects. Her younger sister, Erin, who documented every gathering with her phone as though our lives were content she was producing. A handful of Natalie's employees, a few potential clients she was courting, and Blake Hargrove, the man she had introduced to everyone as her new strategic director, and whom I had understood for some months now to be something else entirely. Blake moved through our home that evening as though he had already measured the rooms and decided what he would change. He refilled glasses he hadn't poured, laughed at the right moments, and positioned himself beside Natalie in a way that stopped just short of obvious. I watched all of it from across the room, carrying a tray of drinks that no one had asked me to carry because it gave me something to do with my hands. When Natalie called everyone's attention for the cake, I thought she might for once let the evening be what it was supposed to be. I walked to the table. The candles were lit. Someone dimmed the lights. She came to stand behind me and placed her hand on my shoulder, and for a moment I let myself believe the gesture was what it looked like. Then her hand moved to the back of my neck. The frosting filled my eyes before I understood what had happened. The table shook. A glass tipped and spread red wine across the white cloth. The room erupted into laughter, not the uncomfortable kind that follows an accident, but the loose, delighted kind that follows something people were waiting for. Erin had her phone up before I lifted my head. Blake was applauding. Denise was saying something about how I should learn to take a joke. Natalie was already stepping back toward Blake's side of the table. She had not planned the cake as cruelty for its own sake. She had planned it as punctuation. The envelope came next, placed beside the ruined dessert, like an afterthought she had been holding on to for weeks. I knew what was inside before I touched it. I wiped the frosting from my face, slid my ring off to clean the engraving. A small compass carved into the band, the kind of detail no one in that room had ever thought to ask about. And I looked at her. She told the room she was done carrying a man with no future. She said she and Blake would be moving the company forward together, and that I had 30 days to remove myself from a house she had decided was hers. The words came out clean and rehearsed like something she had written and revised until she was satisfied with the rhythm of it. I said thank you, not sarcastically. I said it because in that moment, looking around at the people laughing and recording and nodding along, I understood something I had been circling for months without landing on. I walked out of the room and left the envelope on the table. That night, I slept on the sofa in my workshop under a drop cloth I used to cover refinished pieces before they dried. The building smelled like mineral spirits and sawdust, and it was the most honest place I had been in years. What I did not tell Natalie, and what I had not told anyone outside of a very small circle of people, was that the house she had just claimed as her own had never been in her name. It had never been in mine either, not exactly. It was held under a trust called Stonewick Residential, which had been established well before our marriage by my father's estate attorneys, and which was connected to a name Natalie had never thought to look up. The Northcott name. My father, Gordon Northcott, built Northcott Dominion Group over 40 years in Charlotte. Hotels, commercial real estate, private credit funds, a network of conference centers across the eastern half of the country. He was not a man who appeared in the kind of press that Natalie read, which was part of why it had been easy to keep the separation between my two lives intact. I had chosen that separation deliberately. I wanted to know what it felt like to be worth something to someone who didn't already know what my last name meant. I wanted to build something with my own hands, even if what I built was modest. And I had wanted perhaps naively to find out whether a marriage could hold together on its own terms, without the weight of inherited money pressing down on every decision inside it. 6 years had answered that question. The morning after the party, I was making coffee on the workshop's small burner when my phone showed a notification from a credit monitoring service I had set up years ago as a precaution. A business line of credit. In my name, one I had never opened was past due. The amount was not small. I put the coffee down and sat with that information for several minutes before I started making calls. By early afternoon, I had confirmed that my personal information and a digitized version of my signature had been used to secure the credit line. The account had been active for nearly 8 months. I pulled the transaction history and worked through it carefully. Equipment rentals, vendor deposits, hotel bookings that matched the dates of Natalie's company retreats, and one purchase from a high-end watch dealer in uptown Charlotte, a timepiece that I had noticed the previous evening sitting on Blake Hargrove's wrist while he applauded my wife pushing my face into a cake. I called Natalie. She told me I had probably signed something without reading it and forgotten, which was the kind of thing she had always implied I was capable of doing. I asked her to say that again slowly. She did not. Blake sent me a text message an hour later, suggesting I consider the divorce offer carefully, and warning me that any action I took against Natalie's reputation would result in Varden Event Works pursuing legal claims against me for interference with their business operations. I read the message twice. Then I called Camille Redford. Camille had handled the Northcott family's private legal matters for 11 years. She was not the kind of lawyer who raised her voice or sent strongly worded letters before she had to. She listened to everything I told her without interrupting, and when I finished, she told me not to confront anyone, not to sign anything, and not to make any public statement about what I had found. Then she told me to start documenting. Over the next several days, I did exactly that. I saved the birthday video that Aaron had posted before apparently thinking better of it and setting it to private, but not before I had already downloaded a copy. I photographed the divorce filing, the credit account statements, and Blake's text message. I contacted my bank directly and requested that all login histories and access records be preserved. I filed a freeze on my credit profile. I reached out to the document verification firm that Camille's office used and had the electronic signature on the credit application analyzed against a database of my actual signed documents. The results came back within 48 hours. The signature had been assembled from components of real documents. I had signed consent forms, service agreements, a home maintenance authorization from 3 years prior. Someone had done it carefully, but not carefully enough. Throughout all of this, Natalie was operating as though the outcome had already been written. She sent a formal divorce proposal through her attorney that asked for full ownership of the house assignment of half the Varden Event Works debt to me, a confidentiality clause covering the affair, and a restriction on my ability to contact her clients or investors. The proposal had been drafted with the confidence of someone who expected compliance, not negotiation. She had decided I would take what she offered because she could not imagine a version of events in which I had any other option. What she did not know was that Camille had already been quietly coordinating with the Northcott family's legal team not to intervene publicly, not yet, but to ensure that every record was preserved and every door remained open. She also did not know that Varden EventWorks had been in preliminary discussions with Northcott Dominion Group about a long-term event management contract for the company's hotel properties across the Southeast. The deal, if it came through, would have been large enough to stabilize everything Natalie was quietly hemorrhaging. The deal was still under review, and the person who would ultimately sign off on it was me. I did not feel triumphant about that fact. I felt tired in the particular way that comes from realizing a situation is larger and more complicated than the injury at the center of it. I had been humiliated in my own home in front of people who filmed it for entertainment. My identity had been used to open a credit line that funded another man's wardrobe. My wife had handed me divorce papers as though she were doing me a favor by making the terms explicit. Those were real things and they deserved to be treated seriously. But the moment I started thinking about Varden EventWorks as a weapon, as something I could simply end because I now had the standing to do it, I would become something I did not want to be. There were people at that company who had nothing to do with what Natalie and Blake had built between them. Whatever happened next, I was not going to let anger make the decision for me. Camille called me on a Thursday evening to tell me about Carolina Venture Honors. The event was scheduled for the following month at the Hawken Ridge Hotel in downtown Charlotte, one of the flagship properties in the Northcott portfolio. My father had decided that the announcement of the group's leadership transition would happen there publicly at a gathering that already had the attention of the city's business community. Wesley Northcott would be named the incoming chairman of Northcott Strategic Capital. The engraving on the ring I had worn for 6 years. The compass that Natalie had called a cheap antique would appear on a screen behind my father in a room full of people who understood exactly what it meant. Varden EventWorks had also been invited to the gala as a prospective partner still pending final review. Natalie did not know any of this. She had been corresponding with Northcott's events team through a third-party coordinator, believing the invitation represented a breakthrough she and Blake had earned. She had, according to information that filtered back through Camille, already drafted remarks she planned to deliver that evening. I put the phone down and went back to the piece on my workbench. The ring was beside me. I had taken it off to refinish a cabinet door force of habit so I wouldn't scratch the band. I picked it up, turned it once in the light, and set it back on my finger. Then I went back to work. The version of events that Natalie put into circulation was cleaner than what had actually happened, and she released it quickly. Within days of the party, the story moving through her professional network was that the marriage had run its course, that she had made a difficult but necessary decision, and that Wesley, her soon-to-be ex-husband, had taken it poorly because men like him always struggled when the woman beside them outgrew the arrangement. She did not use those exact words in any single conversation. She was too careful for that. But the impression accumulated, and by the end of the first week, I was aware that people who had never met me had already formed a complete picture of who I was. Natalie held a brief meeting with her staff in which she addressed the situation directly. I heard about it through Camille, who had a quiet line into certain corners of the Charlotte business community that I had never asked too many questions about. Natalie told her team that the divorce was amicable, that the company was stable, and that Blake would be taking on an expanded leadership role during what she called a period of transition. She framed Blake's presence not as the cause of anything, but as the solution to it, the steady professional hand guiding Varden EventWorks through a moment of personal disruption. Denise called me on a Tuesday morning. She did not begin with a greeting. She told me that Natalie had been more than generous with the divorce terms that a man in my position should understand when he was being offered a way out with his dignity intact, and that the house, which she referred to as Natalie's house, with the kind of certainty that comes from never having checked a document, would obviously remain in the family. I listened to the full length of what she had to say. When she finished, I told her I would be in touch through my attorney. She told me I didn't have an attorney worth mentioning. I thanked her and ended the call. Aaron's contribution was a series of short videos posted over the following week, none of which named me directly, but all of which featured captions about women who carried their households while their partners coasted. One of them received several thousand views before she set it to private. I had already saved a copy of that one too, the same way I had saved everything else, not out of bitterness, but because Camille had told me early on that documentation was the only language that held up when feelings became irrelevant. What Natalie did not know was that while she was managing perceptions, Camille and I were building something considerably more durable than a narrative. The forensic review of the credit application had come back conclusive. The electronic signature used to open the account in my name had been constructed from pieces of documents I had signed over the preceding 3 years, assembled with software that left a traceable footprint on the device where the work had been done. That device had been registered to a Varden EventWorks business account. Camille filed the appropriate preservation requests with the relevant financial institutions and said nothing further about it publicly. Meanwhile, the picture of Varden EventWorks that emerged from the preliminary financial review was not the picture Natalie had been presenting to investors and prospective partners. The company was not growing. It was maintaining the appearance of growth by deferring costs, inflating projections, and running on a credit structure that required continuous refinancing to stay functional. Blake had collected consulting fees from the company that were on paper tied to performance benchmarks. Benchmarks written in language vague enough to mean almost anything. A portion of the money that had flowed out through those fees had ended up paying for things that had no connection to Varden EventWorks business operations. The watch was the most visible example. It was not the only one. The formal divorce proposal that arrived through Natalie's attorney had been drafted with considerable care, the kind of care that suggested someone had thought through which concessions would most effectively neutralize me. What it had not accounted for was the Stonewick Trust, the forensic signature analysis, or the fact that every email Blake had attempted to delete from the Varden EventWorks server in the 2 weeks following the party had already been captured and preserved at Camille's request. The company's active due diligence relationship with Northcott Dominion Group had triggered automatic document retention across all company accounts, a standard clause in the preliminary partnership agreement that neither Natalie nor Blake had apparently read carefully. Everything Blake thought he had erased had been logged before he touched it. Natalie sent me a photograph sometime in the 3rd week. She and Blake were dressed for an evening event standing in what I recognized as the lobby of the Hawkenridge Hotel. Blake was wearing a dark jacket and the watch. She had written 4 words in the message that accompanied it: "Time to move on." I looked at the photograph for a moment, recognized the hotel's signature lighting in the background, and set my phone face down on the workbench. The following evening, my father called. Gordon Northcott was not a man who wasted the beginning of a conversation on pleasantries when there was something specific he wanted to address. He had heard about the birthday, the divorce, filing the credit account, and the deleted files. He was not calling to express sympathy, though his voice carried the kind of careful restraint that for him served the same function. He told me that the announcement at Carolina Venture Honors was proceeding as planned, and that the transition of leadership to Northcott Strategic Capital would be formal, public, and final. Then he said something I had not expected him to say directly. He told me that if I used the position I was about to assume to settle a personal score rather than to make a governance decision, the family council had the authority to delay the transfer, and he would not stand in their way if they chose to exercise it. He was not threatening me. He was telling me the truth, which was the same thing he had always done. The Northcott name had survived across 3 generations because every person who carried it understood the difference between power used for justice and power used for satisfaction. They were not the same thing, and they did not produce the same results. He said he trusted me to understand the distinction. Then he said good night. I sat in the workshop for a long time after that. The piece I had been refinishing, a cherry wood writing desk with a cracked center drawer, was open on the table in front of me. I had been working on the drawer mechanism for 2 evenings, trying to understand why the joint had failed before I replaced it, because replacing something without understanding why it broke was how you ended up with the same problem in different materials. It was the part of restoration work that most people did not have patience for. They wanted the result. They did not want the diagnosis. The night before the gala, Natalie appeared at the Hawkenridge in a way that was clearly designed to be visible. She and Blake arrived together and made a point of speaking to journalists who covered the Charlotte business community. The story she offered them was light and well packaged. A woman who had rebuilt her company, found a genuine professional partnership, and was looking forward to what the next chapter would bring. She mentioned the divorce in passing the way you mention weather. She did not mention my name. She did not need to. I had arrived at the hotel early to walk the space with Camille before the program began. As I moved through the corridor alongside the main hall, I passed a group of guests gathered around someone's phone near the entrance. I caught a half-second of what was on the screen, the dining room of our house, a birthday cake, a room full of people laughing. Aaron had reposted the video with new context, framing it as an example of what it looked like when you finally stopped settling. The caption had already collected several hundred comments. I kept walking. By the time I reached the end of the corridor, I had worked through what I was feeling with enough precision to name it. It was not rage. Rage had been available to me for several weeks, and I had declined it each time. What I felt was something closer to the sensation that comes at the end of a very long repair job. That particular stillness, when the piece is finally what it was supposed to be, and you understand that the time it took was not wasted because the integrity of the work depended on every hour of it. The marriage was over. That had been true for longer than the birthday party, and I had known it at some level for longer than I had been willing to say. The woman who had stood behind me with her hand on my shoulder was not the person I had married, or perhaps she was exactly that person, and I had simply taken years to understand it. Either way, there was nothing left to grieve. What remained was a set of decisions, and I was prepared to make them correctly. I found a quiet alcove near the back of the hall. My father's words from the night before were still sitting with me, not as a warning anymore, but as a confirmation of something I had already decided. I had spent weeks watching use the divorce process as a performance, watching Blake delete files. He thought no one would ever recover watching Aaron document a version of events that required my silence to stay coherent. And at no point had any of them stopped to consider that they might be wrong about what I was capable of. That assumption, the absolute certainty that I was exactly what they had decided I was the thing that had allowed all of it to happen. I was not going to use the Northcott name to crush them in a single evening. Not because they didn't deserve consequences, but because consequences that came from anger tended to land on everyone nearby, not just the people who had earned them. The employees who had been waiting on late paychecks had not chosen the people managing the company's finances. The clients whose events were still in progress had not signed up for what Natalie and Blake had been building between them. If I burned it all down out of personal satisfaction, those people bore the weight of it. What I had decided standing in that alcove was that the truth did not need my help to be damaging. It only needed the right structure around it, independent, documented, and administered by people with no personal stake in the outcome. That was the only kind of accountability that meant anything. I straightened my jacket and walked toward the main entrance of the hall where the program was already being called to order and my father was preparing to take the stage. The main hall of the Hawkenridge Hotel was the kind of room that had been designed to make people feel the weight of occasion. High ceilings, warm light arranged to flatter everyone, equally round tables set with the precision that signals someone had been paid well to care about the details. I had attended a site walkthrough there 2 years prior, accompanying my father's facilities team on a renovation assessment introduced to no one as anything other than a consultant. I had preferred it that way at the time. Standing at the back of the same room now waiting for my name to be called from a stage I had helped fund, I understood how completely that season was over. Natalie and Blake were seated near the front at a table reserved for prospective partners. Denise and Aaron were with them, dressed for a celebration they had already decided was theirs. Natalie had a leather folio in front of her, the kind she used when she was preparing to deliver remarks. She had written something. She intended to use it. My father took the stage at precisely the time the program indicated he would. Gordon Northcott did not run late, and he did not run long. He spoke about the company's history and about the particular challenge of building something that was meant to outlast the person who built it. He spoke about stewardship, the way people speak about it when they actually mean it, rather than as a word deployed to fill space in a speech. The room was attentive in the way rooms become when the person speaking has earned the silence rather than simply demanded it. Then he said my name. The screen behind him lit up with the Northcott compass. The same design that had been on my ring for 6 years. The same engraving Natalie had looked at across the breakfast table on hundreds of mornings without ever asking what it meant. My father said the full title, Wesley Northcott, beneficiary of the Northcott Continuity Trust and incoming chairman of Northcott Strategic Capital. I walked from the back of the room to the stage, and the applause that followed was the kind that takes a moment to build because the audience is still processing what it has just understood. I did not look at Natalie's table when I walked past it. From the stage, I could see the room clearly, and what I saw was not triumph. I want to be precise about that because the temptation to frame it as a moment of victory was real. What I saw was a room full of people recalibrating, and at one particular table near the front, 4 people encountering the distance between the story they had been telling and the one that had just been told. Natalie's folio was closed. Blake had gone very still. Denise was looking at the compass on the screen and then at the ring on my hand, working through an arithmetic that was not coming out the way she had expected. Erin had her phone face down on the table, the same phone that had been raised and recording the last time she and I had been in the same room together. I spoke briefly about what Northcott Strategic Capital would prioritize in its next phase: transparency and how capital was deployed, accountability in the partnerships the company chose to formalize, and a governance structure that protected the people doing the actual work inside the organizations the group chose to support. I did not editorialize. I did not gesture toward anyone in the room. The words stood on their own, and the people who needed to hear them as directed at themselves heard them that way without any help from me. After the program concluded, Camille arranged for Natalie Blake and their attorney to be escorted to a private meeting room off the main corridor, framed as a preliminary conversation about the Varden EventWorks contract review. I was not in the room when they arrived. Camille went in first with 2 members of the Northcott legal team and the lead auditor from the independent firm that had been reviewing the company's financials. Camille had set the materials on the table in a specific order, beginning with the Stonewick Residential Trust documentation, alongside the acknowledgement form Natalie had signed during the 2nd year of our marriage, a standard disclosure her own attorney at the time had included in the paperwork which she had initialed without reading. The form stated clearly that she understood the property was held in a separate trust and carried no marital claim. Camille placed it in front of Natalie's current attorney without comment and allowed the room to work through what the document said. Blake had spent the preceding weeks convincing himself the evening would go differently, and the confidence he had carried into the gala had already begun to erode from the moment my father said my name. By the time Camille reached for the second folder, Blake's attorney leaned over to say something to him quietly. Whatever it was, it did not help. Before Camille opened the folder, Blake turned to Natalie, not whispering, not calculating, but speaking with the clipped panic of someone whose version of events had just collapsed faster than he could reorganize it, and said that she was the one who had told him the signature was a formality because her husband would never check. The room went quiet in the way rooms do when something has been said that cannot be recalled. Natalie's attorney set his pen down. Camille did not change her expression. She simply opened the second folder and continued. The device forensics, the transaction history, the watch receipt, the consulting fee records, the preserved emails. She laid it out in sequence without commentary, the way you present something that does not require you to argue for it. By the time Natalie attempted to claim I had been aware of the credit arrangement, Blake had already contradicted her twice in front of witnesses. The mutual project of managing the narrative, which had sustained both of them for weeks, collapsed in that room in roughly 40 minutes. What replaced it was not confession, so much as exposure. 2 people who had built a shared fiction suddenly unable to coordinate its maintenance, each defaulting to self-preservation in ways that confirmed the other's culpability. I was not there to see it. I had remained in the main hall, had a brief conversation with 2 journalists who covered the business community, and eaten a plate of food that I did not particularly taste. When Camille came to find me, she said only that the preliminary session had been productive and that we should proceed as planned. The weeks that followed were administrative in nature, which made them both easier and harder than the acute moments had been. The audit of Varden EventWorks was completed and submitted. Natalie was formally removed from operational leadership pending resolution of the financial review. Blake's contract was terminated, and a demand for restitution was issued, covering the consulting fees deemed improper. The company itself was placed under independent management. a firm experienced in stabilizing organizations without dismantling the work of the people inside them who had done nothing wrong. The employees received their back pay within the first week of the new management's tenure. The clients with active events were assigned dedicated coordinators and kept informed. Varden EventWorks did not close. That had been my condition from the beginning. The divorce was finalized through a process considerably less dramatic than the proposal Natalie's attorney had originally submitted. The Stonewick Trust documentation made the house question unambiguous. The fraudulent credit account was removed from my name entirely once the bank completed its internal review. The debt associated with it was assigned back to Varden EventWorks, and Natalie and Blake were jointly liable for the portions used for personal expenditure. Natalie came to see me once about 3 weeks after the gala. She arrived at the workshop unannounced on a Wednesday afternoon and said several things in sequence that she had made serious mistakes, that the pressure of the company and Blake's influence had distorted her judgment, and that she was sorry. I listened to all of it. And then she said the thing that told me everything I needed to know about what the apology actually was. She said that if I had been honest with her about the Northcott name, the trust what I actually came from, she would never have treated me the way she did. I looked at her for a moment. Then I asked her whether a man needed to be a billionaire before his wife would consider him worth respecting. She did not answer. Not because the question was unfair, but because any honest answer would have confirmed what she was not yet ready to confirm. She left shortly after, and I did not hear from her again except through attorneys. Denise sent a written apology 2 weeks after the gala. Aaron reached out with a message saying the videos had been a mistake and asking if we could talk. I read both carefully. I did not respond to either. The timing told me everything. Both messages had arrived only after it became clear who I was, which meant they were not expressions of regret about what had been done. They were responses to new information. There is a specific kind of silence that is not coldness but clarity, and that was the silence I offered both of them. I sold the house. There was no reason to keep it. It had never felt like mine, and what it represented now was not something I wanted to maintain. I moved to a smaller place closer to the workshop, an older brick building that needed significant work. I spent the first month repairing the window casings and rehanging 2 doors that had been installed improperly at some point in the previous decade. It was slow, precise work, and I found it steadying in the way I always had. I took the chairmanship at Northcott Strategic Capital formally in the month following the gala. My father shook my hand the way he had when I opened the workshop, not with ceremony, but with the particular weight of someone who means the gesture. I kept the workshop running. Some of the people who had worked with me there had been with me for years, and the work still meant something to me in a way that a title could not replace. I saw no contradiction in holding both. The initiative that grew out of everything that had happened, the program I eventually formalized as the Compass Line Initiative, did not begin as an announcement or a press release. It began as a single page I wrote by hand one evening in the workshop, sitting alone after the rest of the staff had gone home. I wrote down what I wished I had known earlier: which questions to ask a bank when you suspect your information has been used without consent, which documents to preserve, what rights existed for people who had been financially exploited inside a marriage and who had stayed silent because they feared no one would take them seriously. Men especially, because the fear of being dismissed or mocked for admitting to that kind of vulnerability was something I understood from the inside. The program that eventually formed around that single page was small. At first, a collaboration with 2 attorneys and a financial counselor who had their own reasons for caring about the problem. It grew without my having planned for it to grow, which I took as evidence that the need had always been there, quietly waiting for someone to name it. A year after the birthday that had ended in frosting and divorce papers, I organized a gathering at the workshop. It was not a party in any formal sense, just my father, Camille, the people who had worked with me in the building for years, and a few friends who had been consistent in the way that matters. Someone brought a cake. When it was time to cut it, I picked up the knife myself and divided it into even pieces, without ceremony, without anyone filming, without anyone testing whether I could be made into a punchline. The compass ring was on my hand where it had always been. My grandfather had commissioned the design because he believed every person who carried the Northcott name should have something that reminded them of orientation, not direction, not destination, but the capacity to know where you actually were, regardless of where you wanted to be. Natalie had looked at that ring for 6 years and seen a cheap antique. What she had never understood was that it was never meant to signal wealth. It was meant to ask something of the person wearing it. It asked whether you knew where you were, whether you were capable of finding your way back to yourself after someone had spent years telling you that you were less than what you knew yourself to be. Ruin and vindication both passed through that room over the preceding year, and the thing I carried out of all of it was simpler than either. The people gathered in the workshop that evening had not asked me what I was worth before they treated me with care. They had not needed the Northcott name to decide I deserved a seat at the table. That more than the chairmanship or the trust or the outcome of any legal proceeding was what I had been looking for the entire time. Abuse in a marriage is not always visible. Sometimes it looks like a room that laughs on cue. Sometimes it looks like a signature you didn't sign on a document you never saw for a debt you're suddenly expected to carry. Sometimes it looks like 6 years of being told in 100 small ways that you do not quite measure up and believing it just enough to stay quiet. If any part of this story sounded familiar to you, I want you to know that the silence you've been keeping is not the same as consent. You are allowed to document what happened to you. You are allowed to find someone who will take it seriously. And you are allowed to walk out of a room that has never actually been yours to stay in. If stories like this one matter to you, subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it. There is always someone who does.